The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. Earlier this week, new rules kicked in that officially bar cyclists and users of non-motorized personal mobility devices, such as kick scooters, from using designated pedestrian-only paths in towns across Singapore. Violators face fines of up to 2,000 Sing dollars, jail time of up to 3 months, or both. While the aim is to enhance safety for vulnerable pedestrians, especially seniors and young children, the move has also raised questions about infrastructure readiness, enforcement fairness, and the future of active mobility in Singapore. But as Singapore redefines the rules of shared space, questions remain. Is this approach too strict or not strict enough? Are we striking the right balance between pedestrian safety and active mobility? Well, joining us today to share more is Wilson Low, who's a mountain bike guide and director at Raw Epics. Hi, Wilson. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi there, Hongbin. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. I'm looking forward to this chat about the latest issues with the regulations regarding paths on bicycles and pedestrians.
Well, let's dive right into it. As you mentioned, from this week, people riding bicycles or non-motorized PMDs like kick scooters will no longer be allowed on designated pedestrian-only paths in towns across Singapore. What do you think were the key motivations behind enforcing this ban now?
I think one of the key things that was on the minds of everybody involved, including the stakeholders, and I'm sure the authorities, was safety. I think definitely safety for all kinds of users, not just pedestrians per se, but also different types of wheeled vehicle or wheeled device users. They could be like non-motorized bicycles, motorized bicycles, kids on skates, elderly or infirm people who need motorized wheelchairs and so on.
You mentioned safety there. Were there a lot of accidents that happened on these paths? What kinds of data or risk assessments do you think would have informed this decision?
I'm not privy to any of these metrics per se, but I will cite my own previous experience as an instructor who helped out with primary school and secondary school student education regarding safe usage of paths, bicycle paths, and shared walkways and the like. This was like some years ago. And what I can say definitively is that it was definitely a matter of more awareness, like more people need to know. And I think where it can start will be from younger people. I think that's a really one good avenue to start off with, especially with kids who are just getting into riding bikes or riding scooters or inline skates and skateboards and so on. I think it's important to make sure that they learn stuff, but in a fun way. And that was the whole purpose of what we were doing.
Right. Well, Wilson, you're a cyclist yourself. So have you heard any feedback from the cycling community here? Do they feel that this ban is unfair? What are their thoughts?
Yeah, I've definitely heard along the grapevine and within my own chat groups and so on that this might be perceived as a bias against cyclists. And I think what the discussions kind of concluded, in a way, was that, if there was going to be any enforcement, especially where the segregated paths were next to each other, one way this could take would be perhaps a softer approach, but also a fair approach. That is to say, don't start fining people straight away, but maybe give them a warning, or kind of a light tap on the wrist, and make sure that applies to both people on wheeled vehicles and bicycles, as well as pedestrians. For example, pedestrians who intentionally or unintentionally find themselves on the paths where it's only bicycles only.
First-time offenders convicted of riding on a pedestrian-only path can be fined up to $2,000 or jailed for up to 3 months or both. So, you did mention perhaps, giving them a warning, a slap on the wrist. So you think that the current enforcement measures, including fines and a possible jail time, are too strict?
I think it's good that people are aware of these measures, but I think it's also important to realize that people getting used to these measures being enforced will take time. Up till now, the lines and the symbols that have been painted on many numerous paths or shared pathways in Singapore have been deemed as more suggestions, and I think it's still going to be viewed that way for for some time. It'll take time for people to get used to it. It's not a matter of people changing within a day, or even within a week. It's going to take some time to get things going, but I'm sure we'll eventually get there.
Definitely. But how effective do you think that this rule will be in reducing accidents between pedestrians and, cyclists or PMD users?
I think it's a set of rules which also needs to be implemented hand in hand with education. And I would like to point out at this point that there's also the standalone footpaths, which probably might be, in my opinion, a greater cause for concern, because these standalone footpaths are usually narrower. There's no clear demarcation usually, and they might be blind corners, and there are a lot of standalone footpath adjacent kind of paths or sidewalks. It could be void decks and along the HD flat, it could be covered walkways. And the rules surrounding these are not so much rules as so much as being able to exercise common sense, especially when it's really narrow and there's greater risk of conflict arising.
How might this policy also affect different user groups, such as, delivery riders, seniors, or low-income commuters?
Well, that's a really good question. I think one of the things that I had heard in the discussions amongst my groups of friends who are all cyclists was that the idea of there being a hierarchy in terms of like who should give way to who, like and the way I can simply describe this is this: like, people who are faster or more able-bodied should give way to people who are less able or potentially slower to react. And this can include like the very young, like kids who are just learning how to cycle or skate and who may not be entirely aware of the full rules and regulations on one end. And on the other hand, the very infirm or elderly who need or use bicycles or PMAs or PMDs to get around with for their daily activities. And again, on this other end of the spectrum, such people might be less aware of their surroundings or might need a little bit more patience in terms of like getting them to understand that somebody's about to overtake them, or if they are the ones doing the overtaking, to do it very cautiously and with a bigger margin for safety. So I think that whole hierarchy thing idea needs to be maybe discussed a bit more and maybe implemented through education and awareness.
Okay. Well, more than 200 kilometers of footpaths next to cycling lanes have been turned into pedestrian-only paths since the LTA announced this initiative back in August of 2024. Topayo was the first town to get these paths back in January 2025. What did Topayo reveal about pedestrian and cyclist behavior that's now shaping the approach in other towns?
I think what we can learn from the Toa Payoh example is that, I think introducing it in phases, in different stages and town by town, it's definitely a good idea. But I would like to say that feedback on a town by town basis also has to be taken into account. It's not going to be certainly a nationwide kind of implementation, and I think a step-by-step approach is definitely a step in the right direction.
Right. I mean, these paths are now found in towns including Tampines, Pongo, Sengkang, Yishun, and Clementi. Could this policy pave the way for more differentiated lanes and stricter enforcement in other parts of the city as well?
Yeah, I think it's definitely one way this could actually gain wider spread implementation. And I think this does inform us about, what other potential solutions, with respect to our transport needs that we can see shaping up in the near and the far future. For example, I'll say that as more and more people live and work in Singapore, population density is going to be even higher, and there's going to be an even greater burden on public transport, not to mention private transport. But I think we could definitely suggest to the Land Transport Authority to look at having not just more segregation, but also other solutions that will go hand in hand with the segregation. For example, dedicated bicycle lanes on roads, and that will actually ease some of the burden that will be placed on segregated cycle paths, especially when it comes to commuting during rush hour and so on.
Right. Well, what does the shift say about the future of mobility here in Singapore, you think?
Well, I read a recent article about mobility in Singapore, and I think how the government and how society in Singapore goes forward on this point really reflects how we as a nation can actually give back time. I always think of transport and mobility as either a time waster or a time saver, depending on how much time you actually end up commuting. And the fact of the matter is that, if you're not going to get 100% of the needs met 100% of the time through the public transport system alone. So definitely not going to get everybody to start buying cars because, as you know, owning a private car in Singapore is prohibitively expensive for quite a number of
Definitely.
people.
Right.
And I think having a bicycle, whether it's a regular bicycle or an e-bike or an e-scooter or some version of this, actually helps ease the load in terms of commuting. You can also get to deal with things like the so-called last mile transport issue where, the very last mile of commuting from the MRT station to the office, for example, or from the MRT station to your school, that can be kind of taken care of by personal transport, through a bicycle, by a scooter, and so on.
Well, are there any trade offs between safety and accessibility that policymakers should be monitoring closely?
Yeah, I think they should be paying attention more. And this is just my own opinion, but you can definitely look at things like minimum speeds, like should there be tougher regulations on minimum speeds? Should there be certain minimum widths of certain thoroughfares, certain pathways, like in and around buildings, especially? I think these things can be studied, but more importantly, I think common sense has to prevail, and it comes down to educating people once again. A very good example would be if there's a cycle path and it goes past a bus stop, and this is what I was told to teach the kids when I was an instructor. Very, very simply, we were taught to tell the kids, just get off your bike or get off your scooter and push past the bus stop, but it sounds very logical, but in terms of actual practice, you're probably not going to get many commuters on their bikes getting off to push that 10 to 15 meters past a bus stop, So it's easy to say that you're going to implement it through awareness, but in actual practice, it could be a little bit harder to kind of practically enforce or practically carry out.
Makes sense. Well, the Minister of State for Transport, Bae Keng, said that enforcement officers would consider the ground situation. I mean, for instance, a cyclist moving into a pedestrian-only path to avoid an obstacle won't be penalized. However, there's also an emphasis on cultivating a culture of gracious path sharing and protecting the safety of those vulnerable. So, Wilson, what kinds of situation would be reasonable exceptions for cyclists using pedestrian-only paths? Do you think there's enough clarity now on where enforcement will draw the line between, acceptable and errant cycling?
Yeah, I think you have to always consider the context before you start penalizing people and potentially upsetting people. For example, if a commuter was going from point A to point B along East Coast Park, you probably want to be pretty strict with that person. They want to get from point A to point B. They might be at or close to the speed limit of the segregated cycle path. On the other hand, on the same day, at any given time, you might have a family, who's also cycling, or perhaps they're walking and they're all spread out, and they're just taking their time along the same path. Then you would look closer into like, what's the context of this? As an enforcement officer, do you really want to upset that family and say, hey, I'm going to start penalizing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of you before kind of straying off the footpath into the segregated cycle path? Or if they were cycling as a group, you would penalize them for straying into the footpath. I think these kinds of issues, as you mentioned, need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. And the enforcement officers, I think if they exercise more empathy and more awareness, that could go a long way into getting everybody on the same page.
Definitely. But how can cyclists ensure that they won't be unfairly penalized if they need to briefly use a pedestrian-only path for safety reasons?
Yeah, I think one of the points raised, for example, was that, if there's an unavoidable obstacle in the way, that could be like a piece of trash or something, rubbish bin that's fallen over, or a tree branch is on the floor. I think these are valid points. But at the same time, you also need to consider more errant or more intentional breaking of the rules where people may say like, oh, it doesn't matter because I'm in a rush, and that kind of doesn't give them the leeway necessarily to justify that they can break the law. A good example would be food delivery riders who use electric or motorized devices, and for whatever reasons, I'm sure in the interest of saving time or expediting a delivery, they may choose a walking only path as the path of choice. That could be upsetting, for them if an enforcement officer told them, hey, you can't use this. And it's a bit of a touchy subject, to be honest. I certainly don't want to see people's livelihoods impacted because of very strict enforcement. So again, I think context needs to be taken into account.
Well, is there a long-term vision for how Singapore will continue to evolve its active mobility infrastructure, especially in older towns like Toa Payoh?
Yeah, I think it's important to consider the fact that, as older towns, when you say older towns, it could mean a few things, right? It could mean increasing aging population. It could also mean like more and more people are aware of the importance of getting around through their own means. I think older towns definitely fall in that bracket, especially when you have more elderly or infirm folks with PMAs, like mobility aids such as motorized wheelchairs and motorized tricycles and such, And I think the approach needed for such so-called older estates needs again to be education, but education that is in line with getting more elderly folks or perhaps folks of an older generation to understand on their own terms why it's important for everybody's good to heed certain rules and be aware of certain safety aspects.
Right. And before we let you go here, Wilson, what else will you be looking out for as the enforcement ban picks up in the next few weeks?
I definitely be looking out for people, personally in my circle of friends, in my circle of clients. I would definitely be keeping my ears open for more feedback in terms of whether people were unfairly, reprimanded, not necessarily fined, but, and also more importantly, like potential problem spots, especially at the places where cyclists frequent. I can only speak in the context of myself as a mountain bike instructor, but also a recreational mountain biker per se, where I use the same bike to go on the trails as well as to commute from the trails to the car park or to the coffee shop or to another meeting place to hang out with my fellow mountain bike friends. And I definitely see, for the most part, not much conflict arising, but within my circle of friends. I think for myself and my friends, we are generally law abiding, but you never know. And I think it's important to always come from a place of empathy and understanding and to consider all points of view as we move forward in this new regulatory environment.
Right. Well, some great insights from you there. Thank you so much, Wilson, for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Hongbin. I appreciate talking to you.
Thank you. That was Wilson Low, mountain bike guide and director at Raw Epics. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.